You're standing on the limestone ramparts of a crumbling medieval city, and you're watching something that shouldn't be possible. Below you, stretching across the scorched valley like a living sea, an army of 18,000 men is assembling siege towers. You look behind you at the narrow streets crammed with every soul from your island grandmothers clutching infants, farmers gripping rusted scythes, children too young to understand that they're about to watch their world end. You count the men beside you on the wall. 800, not 8,000, 800. The enemy doesn't just outnumber your soldiers. They outnumber your entire civilization, every living person on your island, by nearly 2 to 1. This is mathematics as existential horror, and there is nowhere left to run. Before we descend into this impossible siege, I'd love to know, where in the world are you watching this from? It still amazes me that a story from 6 centuries ago can reach someone sitting exactly where you are right now. This is Malta, the 5th day of July, 1429. The island is a speck of limestone in the central Mediterranean, barely visible on maps, yet it sits at the crossroads of 3 continents. For centuries, it has been a pawn traded between empires, Byzantine, Arab, Norman, Aragonese, but the men on those walls don't serve distant emperors anymore. 2 years earlier, in an act of almost reckless hope, the Maltese people had pooled every coin, every piece of family silver, every sack of grain they possessed to pay 30,000 florins to the King of Aragon. They bought something rare in the medieval world, their freedom from feudal resale. A charter guaranteeing they would never again be sold to the highest bidder like livestock. They had purchased their liberty, and now, staring down at the largest invasion force their island has ever seen, they realize the cruel irony. They spent everything to become free men, and now they're too poor to defend that freedom. No mercenaries, no cannons, no reinforcements sailing over the horizon. Just 800 farmers in cotton vests, holding a city that was already falling apart before the first enemy ship arrived. The commander below is Caid Ridvan, a North African general serving the Hafsid Sultanate of Tunis. He is methodical, experienced, and he did not sail here for glory. This is a punitive expedition. For decades, Maltese corsairs, desperate men in leaking boats, have raided Hafsid merchant vessels to survive. They were pirates born of starvation, and now the empire has come to collect the debt in blood. Ridvan's fleet landed on the southern beaches with terrifying speed. There was no negotiation, no warning, no diplomatic envoy. His cavalry swept inland like a scythe through wheat, and within hours the villages of the south were burning. Gaetan Burgu, Marsaxlok, the reaction was pure chaos. Farmers dropped their tools mid-swing and ran. Families abandoned homes that had stood for generations. A desperate human river flowed north toward the only fortified position left, Medina, the ancient hilltop capital. But Medina in 1429 was not the fortress it would become. The magnificent bastions you see today, the ones in tourist photographs, did not exist yet. Those would be built by the Knights of St. John over a century later. What stood in 1429 were Roman and Byzantine walls, eroded by 600 years of wind and neglect. The limestone was crumbling. There were gaps in the masonry where you could see daylight through the cracks. To a professional siege engineer, these weren't walls, they were a polite suggestion. Within 48 hours, the entire population of the island, roughly 10,000 people, had crushed themselves into a city built to hold perhaps 1,000 nobles and their households. Imagine every street packed shoulder to shoulder, not just with terrified refugees, but with their livestock. To deny the enemy food, farmers had driven goats, sheep, and cattle through the gates. The city became a sweating, crying, bleeding mass of bodies and fear. The smell of unwashed humanity mixed with animal waste and smoke from cooking fires that had nowhere to vent. Disease began to spread almost immediately. And then there was the water. Malta has no rivers, no lakes. It is a dry rock baking under the Mediterranean sun. Ridvan knew this. His first strategic move was to seize and poison the freshwater springs surrounding Medina. He assumed thirst would accomplish what his army could not, that within a week the Maltese would stumble out of the gates with their tongues black and swollen, begging for mercy. But he didn't know about the secret beneath the city. Centuries earlier, the Romans had carved massive cisterns directly into the bedrock under Medina, cavernous tanks designed to catch and store rainwater. These had been maintained and expanded over generations. While the sun blazed overhead, millions of gallons of cool, stagnant water sat in the darkness beneath the refugees' feet. It was rationed by the cupful, tasted of limestone in despair, but it was enough to keep them alive. The Maltese were literally drinking the memory of their ancestors to survive. Ridvan wasted no time. His first strike was psychological. Instead of storming Medina, he let his army loose on the undefended countryside, while the 800 Dejma militiamen watched from the walls. Villages burned one by one, grain fields meant for winter turned to ash, and ancient olive groves were chopped down. Worse followed. Hafsid troops swept through caves and valleys, dragging out civilians who had tried to hide. 3,000 were taken families, not fighters, and marched in chains toward the ships at Marsaxlok. The defenders watched their loved ones vanish, trapped in an impossible choice Ridvan hoped would shatter their resolve. But something unexpected happened inside those walls. The grief didn't break them. It calcified into something harder. The militia commanders, led by the local nobility, who had chosen to stay rather than flee to Sicily, made a pact. They would not open the gates, not for their burning homes, not for their captured families. They would hold Medina, or they would die in its rubble. There would be no third option. When Ridvan realized the bait wasn't working, he turned his full attention to the hilltop fortress. The siege engines rolled into position, massive mangonels and trebuchets, their counterweight arms silhouetted against the sky like skeletal fingers. The bombardment began with a crash that shook the bedrock. Stones weighing hundreds of pounds slammed into the ancient walls, and the limestone exploded into dust and shrapnel. The old Roman masonry, already weakened, began to splinter. Gaps appeared. The defenders had no masons to repair them, so they stuffed the breaches with rubble, furniture, anything they could find. They were holding the city together with trash and willpower. Then came the arrows. Thousands of Hafsid archers moved into range and darkened the sky. The 800 men on the walls had no shifts, no rotation. In a normal siege, armies rotate 1/3 fighting, 1/3 sleeping, 1/3 eating. But here, every single man had to be on the wall at all times. If a gap opened, there was no reserve to plug it. They fought with a desperation that baffled the professionals below. They didn't have endless supplies of arrows or oil, so they weaponized gravity. They stockpiled limestone blocks from collapsed buildings and dropped them by hand when enemy infantry tried to scale the walls with ladders. The women of Medina, so often erased from these histories, ran a bucket brigade of terror, boiling water and oil in great cauldrons and carrying the searing liquid up the stairs, while arrows whistled past their heads. When the enemy clustered at the base of the wall, the Maltese poured liquid death down upon them. The screams were enough to haunt the survivors for the rest of their lives. After 3 days of continuous bombardment, The walls were failing, and the defenders were hallucinating from exhaustion. Ridvan ordered the siege engines to fall silent. A heavy, terrible quiet settled over the battlefield. It wasn't a retreat. It was the deep breath before the final plunge. Down on the plains, 18,000 men began to form up for a general assault, a human wave attack designed to overwhelm the exhausted peasants through sheer mass. When the drums began to beat and the horn sounded, the earth itself seemed to move. It wasn't a tactical maneuver, it was a flood. Thousands of infantrymen sprinted toward the walls carrying scaling ladders. From the ramparts, it must have looked like watching an anthill swarm a dying beetle. The first ladders slammed against the limestone with sickening thuds. Hooks bit into the parapets, and then the face of the enemy appeared, veteran warriors in chainmail and boiled leather, wielding curved scimitars, faster and stronger and better fed than the starving men waiting for them. The fighting that followed was nothing like the polished duels of cinema. It was a frantic, suffocating clash fought shoulder to shoulder. On the cramped battlements, technique vanished. Combat collapsed into stabbing, shoving, grappling, and tumbling. Maltese farmers turned their tools into weapons, swinging bills and scythes meant for wheat to hook enemy legs and rip attackers from the walls, sending them screaming to the rocks below. It was brutal, desperate, intimate. A farmer didn't duel a soldier, he slammed into him, toppling ladders and men together. Across multiple breaches, the half-sides pressed hard, corpses forming ramps near the Greeks' gate. Yet still the defenders held, driven by the families behind them and the knowledge that this was only day one. There comes a breaking point in every siege when adrenaline fades and cold reality settles in. Inside Medina, that moment arrived on the third day of the assault. The floors of churches were covered in groaning, wounded. Water was rationed by the cupful. Whispers spread through the refugees. God has abandoned us. The Hafsid army could smell the despair. Ridvan prepared for the final blow. But then something happened that defies dry military analysis, something recorded in Maltese chronicles and passed down through 6 centuries of oral tradition. During one of the fiercest assaults, when the line was buckling and enemy soldiers were cresting the parapets, a figure appeared. According to the legend, it was a rider on a magnificent white horse wielding a sword of fire, leading a charge from the gates of Medina itself. Beside him rode another figure, identified as Saint Agatha. To the modern mind, this sounds like fantasy, but you have to understand the medieval Maltese psyche. This wasn't just a Christian island, it was the island of the shipwreck. In the Bible's book of Acts, St. Paul was shipwrecked here. He wasn't a distant historical figure to these people. He was their spiritual father, their protector, their patron. When the cry, "St. Paul is with us," erupted, the starving defenders transformed instantly into a holy army. The Dijma surged with near-mad ferocity, terrifying the Hafsid troops. Rumors of a spirit aiding the peasants spread, shattering discipline. Panic rippled through the invaders, and Ridvan's assault collapsed into a forced retreat. While the defenders praised St. Paul inside the Hafsid command tent, Ridvan was looking at casualty reports. War, for a commander like him, was a business transaction. He'd come to Malta with specific objectives: punish the pirates, secure slaves, loot the island. He'd achieved 2 out of 3. His ships were loaded with treasure. His holding pens were full of 3,000 captives. The only thing he hadn't done was take Medina, and as he looked up at those blood-slick walls, he had to ask himself a cold, pragmatic question. Was this rock worth it? The assault had cost him hundreds of his best troops. Disease was spreading in his camp. Water was running low for his own men. If he stayed another week to starve out the city, he risked losing more soldiers to dysentery than to enemy spears. And for what? A dusty hilltop inhabited by people who clearly preferred death to surrender. This is where history diverges from romantic tales. The siege didn't end with a final glorious battle. It ended with a logistical decision. Ridvan calculated that the cost of capturing Mdina now exceeded its value. 3 days after the Great Assault, the sentries on the walls saw something confusing. The siege towers weren't moving forward, they were being dismantled. The tents were being struck. The Hafsid army wasn't rooting in panic. They were packing up in disciplined order. But as they turned their backs on Medina, they left one final scar. They scorched the earth behind them. They cut down olive groves that had taken decades to grow. They poisoned the wells. They burned the farmhouses that had survived. It was spiteful, calculated ecological warfare designed to ensure that even though the Maltese had kept their lives, they would have nothing to eat. When the last Hafsid galley disappeared over the horizon, the gates of the silent city creaked open. The defenders stumbled out into blinding sunlight, their bodies emaciated and filthy. They had won against odds of 22-1. They had forced an empire to blink. But as they looked out over the blackened fields and empty villages, the celebration died in their throats. Because while the army was gone, they had taken a piece of Malta that could never be replaced. 3,000 people, 1 out of every 4 on the island, were gone. This wasn't just a loss of life, it was an amputation of the nation's future. The young men who would have rebuilt the farms, the young women who would have borne the next generation, the craftsmen who knew how to cut stone and build ships, the Hafsids had stolen Malta's tomorrow. And the cruelest part, in the medieval world, if your family was taken by raiders, you could usually buy them back through ransom. But the Maltese had already spent everything, those 30,000 florins, to buy their political freedom. The coffers were empty. The church had melted down its silver. There was no money left, so the survivors could only stand on the cliffs and watch the ships disappear, knowing their loved ones were being taken to the slave markets of Tunis, and they were too poor to save them. They had purchased their liberty as a nation, but they couldn't afford the liberty of their own children. This mass abduction left a scar on the Maltese psyche that lasted for centuries. It explains why, when the Knights of St. John arrived 100 years later in 1530, they described Malta as a desolate, underpopulated rock. Villages that had stood for centuries were ghost towns, their names disappearing from maps, remembered only in whispered stories as the places where they came and took everyone away. The siege of 1429 was a tactical victory. The flag still flew over Medina, but strategically and demographically, it was a catastrophe. And here's what changed. The survivors realized that the King of Aragon had not sent a fleet. The Pope had not sent a crusade. The powerful nations of Europe had simply watched to see if the little island would sink or swim. They had swum, but the water was full of blood. This realization changed something fundamental in the Maltese character. Before 1429, they were subjects of a distant crown. After 1429, they were survivors. They understood their existence on this rock was precarious, that their safety depended entirely on their own stubbornness. In the years following the siege, the island didn't just rebuild, it hardened. The fortifications were repaired, not with royal gold, but with local sweat. The Dijma militia became more than a feudal obligation. It became a point of national pride. These farmers knew that the next time sails appeared on the horizon, and they knew there would be a next time, they couldn't rely on miracles. they had to rely on the person standing next to them. In 1565, the Great Siege tested Malta against the Ottoman Empire. While the knights supplied leadership, cannons, and funds, it was the Maltese militia descendants of 1429's survivors who held the walls. Their forebears' defiance preserved Malta's people, culture, and faith, making the island's legendary stand against invasion possible. Today, if you walk through the main gate of Medina, you enter a world of quiet, luxury souvenir shops, gelato stands, tourists snapping photos of the sunset. They're unaware they're standing on a graveyard. But if you listen closely to the wind whistling through those narrow limestone alleys, you might hear the echoes. The prayers of 10,000 people squeezed into a space meant for hundreds, the clang of farming tools against hardened steel, the silence of the 3,000 who were dragged away in chains, the price paid so the rest could live. The Siege of Malta, 1429, is not as famous as the battles of Napoleon or Alexander. There are no Hollywood movies, no marble monuments carved with the names of peasant defenders. But perhaps that's exactly why it matters. History is often written as chess, played by kings and generals, but 1429 reminds us that history is also made by pawns, by fathers who refuse to let their families be taken, by mothers who carry boiling oil upstairs while their children cry, by a community that, when faced with the mathematics of extinction, decides to tear up the equation. They had no armor, no allies, no money. All they had was a crumbling wall and each other, and against the might of an empire, that was enough. Their story teaches us that survival isn't always about being the strongest or the richest. Sometimes it's just about enduring one more day than your enemy. And on a quiet hilltop in the center of the Mediterranean, 800 men in cotton vests proved that sometimes, impossibly, that's exactly what happens.